assessing our relative state of health with tongue diagnosis, we first consider its shape. The tongue is muscular tissue we can see with the naked eye. Its shape can give us a general sense for fluid metabolism. Depending on how swollen or thin the tongue is, we can get a sense to ask about systemic water retention. This is classically seen with tooth marks along the sides. This can suggest that the tongue is retaining water to the point that it is pressing against the teeth. A thin tongue, by contrast, may be a sign of anemia or dehydration. Fluid metabolism and the sodium-potassium pump require a sweet spot of nitric oxide. It's then that we contrast the shape with the color. A red tongue with tooth marks is not the same as a pale tongue with tooth marks. Both have derailed sodium-potassium pumps, but this can be caused by very different reasons. In one case, it may be a lack of nitric oxide or improper distribution of gasotransmitters like it. In the other, it can be from excess nitric oxide. So we need to understand the signs of the tongue within the proper context. So we not only look at the shape, but we contrast it with the color. And this begins even before we open our mouths. Our old friend nitric oxide is an important mediator of inflammation. With more inflammation comes differences in facial coloring and the distribution of that facial coloring. It will make the face red or blotchy in different areas. It can make the lips deeply red, while people who have more anemic symptoms or low levels of vasodilating nitric oxide will tend to look pale. As nitric oxide has regulatory effects on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, this will also influence blood circulation and body temperature. The tongue that is pale is traditionally said to be a sign of qi or blood deficiency. In a biological sense, we can think of this as the vasodilating effect of gasotransmitters like nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide being too low. At the opposite end, too much of a gasotransmitter will cause more inflammation and the tongue that will become deeply red or even crimson. To understand blood deficiency in the traditional sense, we need to look at herbal formulas which boost blood. Suwutang, a common formula for nourishing blood, does indeed signal red blood cell production, but it also signals gene expression for several endogenous antioxidants. The yin and yang relationship between qi and blood appears to have a yin and yang relationship to inflammation, oxidation, and antioxidation. Nitric oxide expands blood vessels and increases cardiac contractility. It also has a regulatory influence on blood plasma levels. Meanwhile, the blood vessels serve as a pathway for nitric oxide and other gasotransmitters to travel throughout the body. As the classics say, qi is the ruler of blood, and blood is the house of qi. The shape and color of the tongue give us the first insights into the relationship between qi and blood, and in the same sense, the relationship of inflammation, endogenous antioxidation, and potential signs of blood pathologies. Along with the tongue shape, we look at the position. A tongue which deviates to one side may suggest injury to the hypoglossal nerve, which results in deviation of the tongue toward the paralyzed side during protrusion. The tongue also eventually atrophies more toward the paralyzed side. In these cases, we'll typically ask the patient to present the tongue a few more times to see if it's likewise deviated or if the initial presentation was just because they weren't used to sticking their tongues out. Keep in mind that none of these signs leads to a definitive answer. Instead, we're looking for questions to ask, and appropriate questions based on this initial screening. We also look at tongue motion or undulation. Sometimes this is traditionally called the tongue spirit. Lesser oxidizing stress from reactive oxidative species and inflammation, having excess elevated nitric oxide, can erode nerve tissue, and this can be seen in a tongue that is trembling. This can come from a number of inflammatory disease states, including chronic emotional stress. This is an early precursor that we see before trembling in the fingers or legs, and it may be an early warning sign of oxidative stress causing nerve damage. After these considerations, we start to look at the tongue biofilm thickness. 1 trillion life forms contribute to your physiology and even your personality. They have been passed down from mother to child through the ages and are influenced by your climate and your dietary preferences. Their homeostasis and relative symbiosis create the foundation for health, mental clarity, and immunological defense. With dysbiosis, the gates to the endothelium break down, allowing pathogens to enter and create internal chaos. They even camouflage themselves to override your body's needs through a process called molecular mimicry. This creates internal chaos, and it's why gut dysbiosis is associated with everything from obesity to mental illness and cancer. You have an internal microclimate, a world in miniature. Its heavens are made of gaseous vapors, and an internal landscape covered in trillions of microbiota who travel throughout your digestive tract. Between them, it is an electric potential, which influences intestinal absorption, movement, and the growing conditions within. This balance shifts based on mental states, diet, and immune response. They shape the landscape of your microbiome, and this interplay can be seen even on your tongue's polymicrobial biofilm. A biofilm is a slimy film of bacteria which sticks to a surface. Within the human body, coalitions of fungi, bacteria, and viruses join forces to build biofilms, which range from slimy to calcified fortresses. This central biofilm inside of us is something of a souvenir from our days spent swimming around in a microbial soup. In fact, it can be argued that we don't have a polymicrobial biofilm so much as this microbiome evolved to form an outer casing with arms, legs, and anxiety. Given how direct the gut-brain axis is, there's a sound argument to be made that the ghost in the machine may in part be the collective angelic chorus of 1 trillion metabolic voices. The voices in your head are indeed real, at least in terms of signaling pathways. The length and thickness of this biofilm can give us a sense of how prolific and potentially toxic it may be. We tend to see the biofilm spreading lengthwise before it gets thicker. And this is where we determine what is a thick or thin tongue coating. To get more exact metrics on the dividing line between a thick and thin tongue coating, 60 TCM doctors were polled. The consensus was that a tongue that is less than 2/3 coated is considered to be thin, while those with a biofilm coating extending beyond 2/3 would be considered thick. Tongue thickness gives us a sense as to the presence of traditional concepts of dampness and mucus accumulation. Dampness is seen as an early stage, while long-term dampness creates mucus. It's said that for strange diseases, you should treat mucus, and I believe this is due to the molecular mimicry of gut microbiota and biofilms causing very strange clinical presentations. Either way, restoring gut symbiosis is the fastest way to simplify seemingly complex cases. This polymicrobial biofilm extends from the anus to the tongue. In cases of chronic illness, the fecal bacteria and gas march right up to the mouth and can be detected on the tongue coating. They're also detected in the breath and even in the saliva. The methane is right there, and it tends to understandably make someone less kissable. This is thought to be why humans kiss. In a sense, it's how gut microbes greet one another to see if the hosts will be good breeding stock. It's like when you're making out with a stranger on the bus. At first it seems like a good way to kill the time, but then you realize that their breath stinks. You stop, give them a hug with 2 pats on the shoulder to let them know that it's over, and then you check your smartphone for kitten videos or snuff videos or whatever you're into. What you're detecting on their breath is too much sulfur producing bacteria. too much or too little hydrogen sulfide is associated with poor fertility and chronic illness. If you enjoy lengua tacos as much as I do, you will notice that tongues have some interesting textures. The tongue has its own landscape, and with it, various tissue types, signaling pathways, and growing conditions, which have diverse embryological origins. Like going from the forested mountains to the beach, we find decreasing sulfur-producing bacteria as we shift from one microclimate to the next. Bacterial fragrance associated with sulfur seems to be strongest in the back papillae, with levels around 88, and become gradually less prolific as we go to the dorsal posterior, which has 32, to the middle at 5, and eventually to the dorsal anterior, where we find it at a very humble 1.45. So we can see that as we sort of go down the mountain, the sulfur-producing bacteria become less prolific. And this gives us an indication. As the texture of the tongue changes, we have various growing conditions. And this is why various parts of the tongue may be cluing us in to different disease states. Tongue biofilm color. When we see a black tongue coating, it's traditionally said to be either severe heat or severe cold. This is commonly seen after antibiotic use. The black hairy presentation is caused by hyperplasia of filiform papillae, leading to trapped pigments, desquamation, which is damage to one of the tongue's major tissue types. A tongue coating which is yellow is said to be a sign of heat. This isn't always the case, but it is true more often than not. So what does it mean when we say heat? First, we're talking about the collective metabolic output of all that bacteria, much like the warmth of a compost pile, which can get hot enough to catch fire. The second aspect of heat is the influence that bacterial gut dysbiosis has on generalized immune response and inflammation. This tends to create a chronic low-grade fever. The third way is through molecular mimicry, causing gut bacteria to hijack the hypothalamus via the gut-brain axis. There was a recent study on the association between tongue diagnosis and the tongue coating microbiome using next-generation sequencing. The study included 19 gastritis patients with typical white greasy or yellow dense tongue biofilms corresponding to TCM cold or heat syndromes using 16S ribosomal RNA sequencing protocol designed to profile the tongue coating microbiome. From the 3.7 million V6 tags for each sample, they identified 123 and 258 species-level OTUs that were enriched in patients representing cold microbiota and hot microbiota. The results revealed an important connection between tongue coating microbiome and traditional tongue diagnosis. Another study found that yellow tongue coating samples had a bacillus positivity rate of 72.7%, and that bacillus was not observed in white tongue coatings. Bacillus loves heat, and it likes to turn up the thermostat wherever it can. Bacillus cells growing at 37 degrees Celsius increase toxin-genic transcription compared with cells at 28 degrees Celsius. When they appear on the scene, body temperatures seem to rise. Bacillus release multiple forms of somatostatin-mimicking material. Somatostatins have hyperthermic effects to warm the body. Dr. Jin Zhao used to tell me that heat can produce heat. Dampness can produce dampness. It turns out that this was correct. Heat-causing bacteria can really be seen on the yellow tongue coating. Heat does create heat, and dampness continues to proliferate, creating damp. This wasn't just a metaphor. It was microbiology. In the next part, we will explore the mystery of geographic tongues and peeled tongues.